Well, let's begin in Wellington, where highly secretive deals to form a government have finally been unveiled, revealing exactly how far Labour was prepared to go in order to take power. In a moment, we'll hear from our political editor, Jane Patterson, but first, Labour's leader, Jacinda Ardern, held signing ceremonies in Parliament this afternoon with the leaders of both New Zealand First and the Greens. The centrepiece of Labour's coalition deal with New Zealand First is a focus on regional development with a new $1 billion development fund.
There has been a period of neglect in the last 9 years for our regions. New Zealand First has brought enormous advocacy at the negotiating table to make sure that we see the beginnings of the reinvestment that is much needed in New Zealand.
But the deal didn't go as far as New Zealand First's Winston Peters would have liked on immigration, sticking to Labour's plan to reduce net migration by 20 to 30,000.
Look, I accept that, but we went into negotiations sincerely to try and get a resolution, and we're happy to accept the resolution the way the Labour Party has framed it. And it just so happens that there's an enormous amount of public controversy about those two issues right now, carried by you in the media and carried by experts. So maybe it'll work out.
Meanwhile, as expected, the Green Party agreement includes a referendum on legalising cannabis, as well as an overhaul of the welfare system, including removing excessive sanctions. The Greens leader James Shaw says it's an historic day.
I mean, the fact that we have the agreement, the fact that we are entering government for the first time, and that we have ministers who are going to be responsible for implementing a significant portion of the agenda that we campaigned on.
Well, joining us now is our political editor, Jane Patterson. Good afternoon, Jane.
Good afternoon, Sharon.
Let's look at the details of that deal first with New Zealand First. I mean, we're talking about a port feasibility study, immigration, lifting the minimum wage to $20 by 2020. Can you go through some of those main figures with us?
Sure thing. Now, it's obviously quite a complex deal. There are a lot of policies across several areas, but we'll just look at some of the more outstanding ones. And I think the main one is that $1 billion a year for regional infrastructure development. And of course, that was a really strong theme and a strong push from Winston Peters, the New Zealand First leader, through the campaign. We know that he's going to take the Foreign Ministry and he will also become Deputy Prime Minister. So I would imagine that Shane Jones, one of his MPs, would potentially take this economic development role and potentially an associate finance role as well that is in the deal with New Zealand First to be able to implement that big fund, that big annual fund. Now, other things in there, a couple of surprises really, and one is waka jumping legislation, and this harks back to the late 90s where any MP who leaves the party that they are elected to Parliament under, if they leave to go and support another side, they lose their seat in Parliament. So an electorate MP would have to go and, in a by-election, and re-seek a mandate. A list MP would be gone altogether. Not a lot of detail really about why or the driving motivation for that, but that's in the deal with New Zealand First. And also working towards renegotiating or working towards restarting talks with Russia and the FTA. I suppose they were the two sort of surprising aspects. Immigration, there is just a commitment to work towards strengthening the labour market tests, basically making sure that migrants come here, that they are skilled. Now, Jacinda Ardern said there's not a number in the agreement with New Zealand First, but she's confident that once those measures are taken, that would actually end up with Labour's policy of reducing migration by about 20 to 30,000 people per year. Water quality, again a big campaign issue. Now, there won't be a water tax. That has been abandoned, and Winston Peters had in the campaign said that he would not support that. That is gone from the agreement. But there will be a bottled water levy, as Labour and the Greens and New Zealand First all supported. Ban on foreign buyers buying residential homes. That will be implemented. Jacinda Ardern also talking about plans to restrict access to farmland by foreign buyers, but she said that the OIO would be required. Anything over 5 hectares, the OIO would have to give approval, and she also said they'll be making sure that the OIO actually apply the tests that are in the current legislation, but they don't believe are applying stringently enough to farmland purchases. ETS, there'll be a climate change commission or a climate commission set up. They will decide how and when and if agriculture will be put into the emissions trading scheme and how that might look. Now, Jacinda Ardern said that was done so that those decisions are taken out of the hands and of politicians and into independent commissioners. There was also a reference to reforming and reviewing the Reserve Bank Act. Again, not a lot of detail in the agreement itself, but Ms Ardern said that measures such as employment and price stability would be taken into account, or they would want the Reserve Bank to look at taking those into account.
The Super Gold Smart Card, that's a beefing up of the existing, the gold card for superannuitants?
That's right, and that would include, for example, 1 free doctor's visits and other entitlements, and talk about a different card, so maybe like a flybys type mechanism. So not a lot of detail in the agreement, but that and keeping the age at 65, the age of entitlement, is also part of the seniors policy that New Zealand First and Labour agreed.
So Jane, what would you say were the key things that Labour had to give up in this deal?
Well, we didn't get into that so much. It was more actually what New Zealand First maybe had to give up in the negotiations, and I'm sure that there are things that Labour gave ground on. I'd just like to talk about the Greens quickly, because of course the details of their deal were also revealed today, and that was the expected referendum on cannabis for personal use, and Jacinda Ardern confirmed that the government will move quickly to make access to medicinal cannabis legal. In terms of transport under that deal, the east-west motorway in Auckland, plans for that have been canned, but work will start on light rail from the city to the airport. And also, interestingly in there, especially given the exit of Materia Tude and the controversy around that before the election, in the deal is an overhaul of the welfare system, looking at excessive sanctions, and Jacinda Ardern named one, and that was having to name a father, for example, for single parent support. So expect a review of the welfare system and the Working for Families package as part of that deal.
And also announced a rent-to-own scheme.
That's right, and they hadn't actually put any particular system in place. James Shaw said that when he was in London there were quite a few different schemes, so not a lot of detail around that, but there are of course existing government schemes around accessing home deposits and that sort of thing, so they'll be looking at the suite of initiatives that are already in place, plus building on that to a potential rent-to-own scheme.
Also today, Jane, Bill English has announced that he's staying on as leader of the opposition.
That's right. So the National Party, while these deals were being signed and announced in one room in Parliament, the National Party caucus was meeting in another. They had a caucus meeting at 3 o'clock. Now, a leadership motion was put to that caucus, and it was in unanimous support of Bill English. He says that he will stay on as the leader of the National Party until 2020, and he will fight the next election. And not one person in that caucus opposed it or voted against it in that caucus meeting. Now, of course, he also talked about the new government. He talked about the mood in his National Party caucus as being positive but sober, the need for them to get and develop allies as they go into this term, a recognition that having lost two of their 3 support partners meant that they couldn't form a government. So exactly which parties they'll be and who they'll look to align with, we'll obviously see as we go through the term. But Bill English firmly in the leadership of the National Party as of about an hour ago when he emerged from that caucus meeting.
And Jane, we'll be finding out tomorrow who is going to be in that cabinet, who's in that lineup and who gets what in terms of portfolios.
That's right. So we will get the full cabinet lineup tomorrow. That includes the Labour MPs, the Labour ministers, the New Zealand First ministers who will have cabinet positions, of course, and the Green ministers who have a confidence and supply deal, so they will be ministers outside of cabinet.
Thanks very much, Jane. That's our political editor, Jane Patterson.